welcome to episode 14 of Culture Clash Parenting. We are super excited because we have a guest on the show today who is a third culture kid herself and then raised third culture kids. So here we go.
So this is Colette, and I'll let you introduce yourself, Colette.
Hi, I'm Colette Ballew. I come from many different traditions. As you said, third culture. My mother was American, lived in Paris, met my father, who was Tunisian and Jewish. She was Christian. They married and had two children, moved back to the States. So it was a lot of changing and mixing and, and a lot of traditions that were sort of blended together.
Wow, that's super cool.
Yeah.
So, Colette, then you did have children yourself
Yes.
and you raised them with what tradition?
Well, once again, traditional things were blended once again because I had some Tunisian background. I had some choices from my father's side of the family. I had choices from my mother's side of the family. I lived with my mother, so it was a little bit more, my mother's family was a little stronger in the traditions. But she also insisted that we include the Judaic side because she had learned a lot about it. And so my kids are probably a little bit of mixed American, but my husband's family was from a very deep American from Texas. So you couldn't get more American than that. Didn't really like it when I spoke to my children in French, so that was a tough one. But I did introduce the French family to my children at a young age. We came here quite a lot because my father still lived in France. So we would come, and my kids definitely feel that French is part of their background, as is Judaism, because we brought them up in a Unitarian church. They kind of engulfed it all, included everybody. And I don't know if I would say that they've chosen a religion, but I think they've sort of felt spiritual. And the traditions were more probably Christian oriented, I would say. I mean, though we did celebrate a Seder quite often because I have Jewish friends, so we would sort of blend that in. But Christmas was our tradition. We didn't do Hanukkah, I have to say, because my father's family doesn't do Hanukkah. They're Sephardic, so their tradition was not Hanukkah. They would celebrate the Festival of Lights, and they would light the Hanukkah candles, but it was more about the religious and celebration and gratefulness that the Judaism survived.
It wasn't the commercialism.
It wasn't about Christmas gifts. I mean, it was very funny. Gifts were not a part of my father's family at all. I remember surprising first my aunt, because when I was living in France, it was my birthday, and I was like preparing for the birthday. She's September 11th. I'm the 19th. And I was like, oh, it's her birthday. I have to get her something. And my father looked at me like, what? You're getting her a gift? It's her birthday. Yes, I'm getting her a gift. I'm living with her. I'm going to get her a gift. And so she didn't know what to do with it. She'd never been given a birthday gift. So that was kind of interesting. And then, of course,
Astrid's like, what?
I'm expecting a birthday gift. It's my birthday the next week. And it was a little rough not getting one, but it's okay.
I didn't know that about Sephardic Jews, though. Mostly Ashkenazi Jews, but I'm pretty sure there's one aunt that's Sephardic, and I didn't, because her family's from Greece, and but she always gave us gifts. I don't, that's
Maybe it's just my father's family. Who knows? They were poor. They didn't end up that way, but they did start out that way. I just think it was one of those things that they didn't celebrate birthdays. They just don't. I mean, It wasn't. They didn't single you out on your birthday, which
but Hanukkah as well. I didn't know they don't celebrate Hanukkah.
They did not celebrate.
How did I never know this?
Yeah, just the candles. It was nothing else. It was lighting of the candles and saying the prayers, but there was no gifts. There was no dreidel. There was no chocolates. There was nothing.
I mean, I remember my grandmother talking about how Hanukkah was getting like all commercialized, right?
Yeah.
Like that when she was growing, I mean, she's Ashkenazi, but like growing up in Belgium, like Hanukkah is not a very big religious holiday. It's a historical holiday,
right? Exactly.
Right? So you light the candles, but yeah, it wasn't about gifts. It was
Right.
just that all the Christian kids were getting gifts
Gifts.
for
Maybe that's where it
Christmas.
came from, exactly.
And then the Jewish kids were like, we want gifts.
And I grew up in Westchester, Connecticut, Westchester County in New York, and outside the city. And I remember getting quite a few phone calls over the years because my last name is Cohen. So they're like, why haven't you joined the synagogue? And I was like, well, because in your tradition, I'm not Jewish. And they're like, what do you mean? Your name's Cohen. Yeah, but my mother's
But my
Christian.
mother's not.
Oh, but then that would stop for a while until the new rabbi came. But we always found out, like we didn't get bar mitzvah, we didn't get bas mitzvah, and but there was always that whole tradition around me because there were quite a few Jews in the town I lived in. So, but I have to say the town of Rye, their synagogue was much more liberal, much more probably reformed as opposed to Orthodox. And
Yeah, we have a Reformed synagogue here, and I think the rabbi is female. And my kids have been there, even though I was a shiksa.
So there was a lot more of that so I felt in tune with some of my Jewish friends in high school because they were more reformed. They were not so Eastern European, maybe from background, but not in their traditions.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. They were all going on kibbutzes in the summer and summer camps, and so I learned a lot of Israeli dances and we talked a lot about Zionism and Israel, and because their parents, a lot of their grandparents were Holocaust survivors, so they'd come to the States. So it was interesting. It was a very different background. So when I was talking to my children about things, the Cohen name obviously was a very big part of what my tradition was. And so they connected with that, which was kind of interesting. So I remember thinking, when we were in France this visit, my daughters and I, because my father has passed away, and my sister is living in his house, and she's cleaning out a lot of his closets and boxes and things that he's been holding on to for thousands of years. And there's like one box had 2,500 pieces of art of my father's. Now he's an architect by profession, but he liked to doodle and play and draw, and he worked quite a bit with Paris Scope, so that was part of his background. So my daughters were looking at this thing, and he kept changing his name. He went from just having it signed Cohen to having it signed LEC Cohen. Then he changed to Clay, CLE, because his middle name is E. So it was like very interesting. It was just so they were like, oh, the Cohen, they were really connecting to the Cohen side because he was very intellectual, and so they're looking at these political cartoons that he had done, and it was just very funny. And they were like, yes, I feel I can sense my roots here. So
Did he publish them?
I'm
The
sorry.
political cartoons and the art, did he publish those?
He had published quite a few of them in the Paris Scope, which was a political magazine in the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
He had a lot of things published about his architecture more than his art. His art came later. I mean, he did it all along, but it became his focus towards the end of his life because he had a stroke at a young age and had to stop being professional, had to quit, had to retire very early. I think he wasn't even 50. And he moved to the country and thought, oh, well, I'm an artist now because I'm in the country. So he worked with clay, he worked with wood, he did watercolors, he did pen and ink drawings. It's just like, I couldn't believe it. A lot of this work I'd never seen before. So it was very interesting to go through it.
So cool.
Yeah, it was very, so my daughters have always felt not quite the same way I did, one foot in one culture and another foot in the other culture. I think my daughters really felt the blend of tradition more. Like, my husband's family was from Scandinavia and Europe, and so there were like certain things we did for Christmas cookies. We did kleiners, which are these little fried dough cookies, but they were very similar to the Tunisian ones that I made, which were the honey round ones. And so they're like, oh yeah, it's still the fried dough. And so you powder sugar on these, you poured honey on those, and you had so it was always the blended traditions, and more than it was I guess conscious that this is this, that's that. these are all these different things. The culture that they loved couscous because that was something I had learned to make for my grandmother, and they loved merguez, which is a lamb type of sausage that we would make with my grandmother. Nikitush is one of their favorite soups, and that's my grandmother would make them too. And Meryl was 2, but the last time she had nikitush, but we made it with my grandmother, and my grandmother was bad macular degeneration, so she's basically blind, and she put it all out to, by field, dry it on the trays, and put the trays in the sun on her balcony. And when we walked in to say hello, she didn't realize it was still sunny out because she said, "It's so dark in here." And she's turning all the lights on. It's because the black crows and pigeons had sort of descended upon her nikitush and were eating it all. The room was full of birds that she didn't see. So there were things like that my kids remember. My oldest daughter remembers. But my aunt, up until last year, was still living in Paris. So my mother's sense of identity was very much European. She really identified, even though she was born and raised in America and lived the rest of her life in America after she went back. But her identity was that, she loved Paris. She loved living in Europe. She always talked about her time. She was in a finishing school in Switzerland, and she always talks about that. She talks about one of the traditions that she had started in Paris. As a matter of fact, I think now that you all use it was a German tradition, but because my mother's maiden name was Fry, they were the first ones to have a Christmas tree. And nobody in Paris did that. And so my grandfather actually went to the Luxembourg Gardens and cut down a little pine tree that was just growing and brought it in. And brought it in, and they had the big bow window where they lived and in their apartment. So you set it up in the window with lights, and it was like people kept coming by to see the tree and the lights in the window because they had American lights. They didn't have the candles, which would be more traditional of the Germans, but. So the people they could have sold tickets because there were so many people that walked down this little tiny street to see the lights in the window.
When our Christmas episode and Hanukkah episode, we talked about Candy Cane Lane.
Yeah.
The first Candy Cane Lane in Paris.
In 1949 or whatever it was. It was after the war. It was 1952 maybe, but it was So those blending things were very much a part of what I grew up with. Because I don't think anybody said that in their lives that they were American. They were Canadian American, they were German American, they were Tunisian, so there was always that additional cultural blend into the American part. So and my mom's family was from all over the place, so yeah. It wasn't one tradition or another. It was just like, this is what we do. I remember growing up, I called a load of laundry a Bendix. For the longest time, I didn't know that wasn't what you said for laundry because that's what my grandmother said. And Bendix was the machine that she washed it in. Oh. We're doing a Bendix. I'm like, okay, so you'd all get your whatever you wanted to add to the load of laundry.
That's why the British call it hoovering, right? Like the
hoovering, exactly.
Yeah,
the
same thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Very funny. Very interesting. It was a very different blending of a third generation. It was, because immigrants, and then, when we talk about today in the US, they often talk about DACA and, parents bringing their children in. And my parents did the same thing. We came into the country illegally. We didn't know we did that, but we did. My parents thought they had done it right. They went to the embassy. They thought they had done everything right. And then we get to the States and they stamped the passport, and here we were. It was when we were registering for school. Because my mom had a French preschool, so we didn't go to school. My sister and I did not go to school immediately at kindergarten. So my sister was probably 8, so I would have been 5.5. And the school said, well, where are their papers? Like, where their citizenship, like where the social security card, all those things that you're supposed to have when you register your child. My mom's like, I don't have that. What do you mean? So, it was her first children. She didn't know. So she's figuring out. So she realized we were not registered as Americans. We couldn't get social security cards for a while. because we hadn't registered. We should have had green cards, but we didn't have those. We had to get them. And then that, oh my God, the process. Because what people naturally assumed, and this is still today, what people naturally assume, you're born of American, you're American.
Yeah.
And my father was already losing his citizenship because Tunisia in the 60s was getting their independence. So anybody who was born there that was Jewish could not claim children. But so my father wasn't even trying. So my mom said, "Oh, you're American." So we're on her passport. We get stamped. We're in the country. But we weren't American because there was an immigration law that was protecting the GIs that came over and fought in World War II. They had to be on American soil from the ages of 17 to 24 to claim children. So if you had left before your 18th birthday, which a lot of them did, you couldn't claim a child that was born outside of the country as an American child. My mother left when she was 17 because my grandfather had become a war correspondent for AP, Associated Press. So they were living in Europe. So she couldn't claim, but though she didn't know that. My grandfather didn't know it. The embassy in Paris didn't know it. So we just assumed we were American.
Because America has always had the territorial birthright.
Right. But you have to
everywhere else, it's not.
You have to be born on American soil. So if
Right.
we were born in the embassy,
right,
which
then
is
you would have been
considered
okay.
American soil, or Cannes, could have gone to Cayenne and been born there. There's a section of land that's American there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we weren't American and we were brought into the country under false papers. From the embassy, no less.
And we get this, I mean, we get this all the time with Zachary. He
Yeah.
was born here, and French people assume he's French because he was born here. And we're like, no,
It doesn't work
it
that
doesn't
way.
work that way.
Because
Because
I
France
was-
doesn't
yeah.
have birthright citizenship. He has to apply for citizenship.
It used to have birthright citizenship, but it doesn't
Yeah.
anymore. And same with, I was born here in France. But yeah, so the birthright isn't there.
Yeah. So the rules are always changing.
And people don't realize it. I mean, you don't, unless you're really getting involved in it or trying to get, you know, permanent status or whatever it might be in the country you're living in, you don't realize all the rules can change constantly. And they do. They change all the time. Immigration law changes most often than any other law, or they add amendments to it. Yeah, so it was interesting to not be American, but at this point my first language was American. My first language was English. My second language was French, but my first language was English. And I'm like, I remember the teacher telling me I wasn't American. I'm like, what? So I went home to my mom and I said, what does the teacher mean? I'm not American. Like, what does that mean exactly? She says, oh, when you weren't born here. I said, yeah. Like, okay, so what? Yeah. So she said, my mom had at that point realized with my older sister. I just didn't know. I was 7 when I found out. So, but I was 7 when I had to go through all this process of trying to get an American citizenship, or at least a green card. It took me a couple of years to get the green card, and then it took me another 7 years to get my passport. But it was crazy. It was very, very funny time. But
that's just yet another layer to being a third culture child. So you have a different language at home with the whole speak in your regular voice kind of thing.
Right,
That
exactly.
Owen would tell you, Marissa.
Yeah.
But we have a 4-year-old, and she will tell people. Like I speak French with her because that's my second language, and I speak German to my older ones, and they speak German to her. And then my James's kids, they speak English with her. So she will say, "Oh, I don't speak French," but she'll say it in German.
Right. That's funny. Yeah.
It's very, or she'll mix the whole set. So I don't know if she really feels like she has one particular identity. She's got 2 passports, and there must be like another layer when you're then told, oh, well, the country you live in, that's not you.
That's not you.
Right.
Yeah.
You already feel out of sorts showing up with your mother who speaks something different.
I don't understand. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I had a Romanian friend here in Paris, and his wife was German, and the family lived in Cologne because they were separated. and he still lived in Paris. They lived in Cologne. He probably still lived in Paris because he probably couldn't get the papers to go to live in Germany with them. But yeah, they lived in Cologne, so I went to visit them. And the littlest one was probably 6 or 7 years old at the time when I was 18. And so he comes bounding down the stairs. He says, Guten Tag. And I was like, oh, Guten Tag. So I'd learned what that meant. And I said, Bonjour. He said, ah, oui. J'ai oublié, you parle français. And then he would say, and his brother would say something to me in English because he was practicing English. And he said, you speak English too? Sort of thing. I don't understand. Where are you from? So here he also was trilingual at age 7.
Yeah.
And it was just because it was, and probably, who knows, maybe his father spoke to him in Romanian, I don't know, but it was probably just, natural to him. And I remember feeling that way. I don't know if you ever felt this way, but my father spoke French to us. That was his most comfortable language. Obviously, we didn't speak Arabic, or, he would have spoken to us in Arabic, but he spoke to us in French. And so I never spoke to my father in English. And so when my kids came for the first time, I'm speaking to them in English, but I would turn and tell my father, and he understood English. He went to school in the States, so he spoke English, but never spoke it to me. So I would turn to my father to say something in French. I'd turn to my daughter to say it to in English, and realizing I'm just changing tracks constantly.
It's exhausting.
But what was interesting is I never thought in English. I never thought of translating when I spoke to my father. I just spoke to him in French because that's how I spoke to him.
Yeah.
And to me, it was like, this is the way we communicate. Like, even though my cousins all spoke English, they didn't really speak to me in English when I was living here. But I can't speak to them in English. It sounds weird.
Yeah.
Speaking to my father in English didn't sound right. I had like a weird voice. It was like I was translating the French in my head. It was just weird. But yeah, that was the communication language, was to speak to him in French, not to try to do anything else.
We've talked about this on other episodes because like with my mom, similar, right? Like she and her mom would just constantly be, and family would constantly be switching languages. Like they'd start one sentence in one language and in another.
And in another, yeah.
Yeah, and she still does that. But in part because of my dad, who was really uncomfortable not understanding, and also the time where they were like, oh, it's better for the kid's brain to speak one language. And we were in a majority English country. She spoke to us in English, and then when she would speak to us in Portuguese, I would say, speak in your regular voice. So that's where that came from. And so we've talked about this before, and both my kids, it's very, like you can see the look on their face when I speak to them in French, because like if a friend is over, or if we're at a restaurant or something and I'm tired, and so like my brain doesn't function as quickly. If I say something to them in French, they're both like, who are you? And used to say, speak normal. If I was
in your regular voice.
And my mom's totally like, karma. But it's so fascinating, your story, Astrid, because obviously when we met and with your first two, like you were speaking German, and you still speak German with them. And then I remember when you were pregnant with Cora, you were like, I'm going to speak French with her. And you're like, I'm not sure how I'm gonna, like, I know I can, but also it's gonna be different because it was so.
It's another introduction.
But also you were used to talking to your children in German, and then it was like, here's my child, and I'm supposed to speak to her in French. Not supposed to, like choosing to.
Right? Is her father a French speaker?
No, he speaks. As he likes to say, I speak English on a good day. So he's very American, and he doesn't speak either German or French. So he said to me, well, when we first met, I was still working at the French school. My kids were going to the French school, my first two. And actually, my daughter and I at that time were pretty much exclusively speaking French, because we would drive to school together, come back home, the whole day was in French until their father got home. So even though the first 5 years I raised her completely in German, she picked up the French super fast, and then it just kind of rolled from there. So he heard me speak a lot of French when we first met, and then when our daughter was born, he said, well, I don't understand either, and French sounds nicer, which, to be perfectly honest, he's got a point.
Another point. I agree with him on that.
I have to hear one of these languages all day long.
Oh, I'd rather go for the French. It sounds sexier anyway.
But I teach at a German school on Saturdays. I teach adults at the German school, but they also have kids classes. So I take her now, and she's been picking that up much, much better than just having my kids speak with her for 2 hours a day,
Yeah. No, that's great. I think it's the best thing you can do for a child is to give them, because I realize now it's almost like I can feel the tracks of language. So in English, I don't feel it, but if I start speaking French, I feel like the track gets moved over one. And I also speak Spanish, so it gets moved over two. And then when I try to put the Italian in there, it's like, whoa, yeah. So I can feel it, like it's almost like a train on tracks. It's very interesting, yeah. But
I think
it's communication.
I think what's most interesting about it, and that's why I also try to speak all the different languages with my kids, and it is because one, it makes your brain, like you said, it makes your brain go from different tracks, but it also, I think, makes them more likely to try and understand where somebody else is coming from. Like, I read lips while people are talking, because from that I can already tell, like my brain will tell me what language they're talking before it realizes exactly what language it is, right?
Yeah.
And also, one of the things that I always find fascinating is, depending on what language I'm thinking in or speaking in, I will picture different things. So if I'm thinking bread, I'm thinking, the sliced Wonder Bread type stuff. If I'm thinking pain, I'm thinking, like the thinner baguette. And if I'm thinking brot, it's crusty and dark,
right.
and
dark,
oval shaped.
Yeah.
And it's,
yeah.
panini, again, is something completely different. So
I can totally understand that.
Yeah. It's interesting because I remember, and I think Astrid, we talked about this, not on an episode, but at one point when my grandmother was passing away, she like systematically lost the languages in the reverse order that she learned them. So like on the last day of her life, or the last day that she spoke, she was only speaking Flemish, which nobody except my uncle understood. Right. Like, and it was so bizarre to watch that process, because like I didn't even know that Flemish was really her first language, like because she had grown up in this house with multiple languages, but it was the language that she was spoken to the most by her nanny. And then she was in school in Antwerp, which was Flemish speaking Belgium, right? So even though they had 3 national languages and they at schools learned all 3, they started in Flemish. And it was just really interesting to watch this person who who had communicated in all these different languages, who would flow from one to another, like to go back to the core. I mean, I always think of that as like the core of who she was in terms of language, right? But then watching people be like, oh, like I don't know what she's saying. Like she's not speaking English anymore. Like, oh, now she's like, now she's not speaking Portuguese anymore. Like now she's not speaking like French anymore. It was like this, like, oh, like, and so it's really, I think the way the brain works is so fascinating.
Yeah,
and
very much so.
And when you watch a kid and then hearing your example of like that you're visualizing things differently because the word is connected to an image in your brain.
And
like
a cultural image.
And
I mean,
cultural
like
image.
when you're saying bread, the way, it's a cultural image. It's very interesting. Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think like how our kids see that, right? Because your kids have visited
many different
places as well. But like, yeah, I'm curious, like when we were out with your girls last week, right? And we were talking about the pain au chocolat versus the chocolatine, right? Like even like
I'm team chocolatine.
So you'll love this story. We were in a restaurant in Bordeaux, across from the train station, and on the menu it said pain au chocolat. So Colette's daughter ordered pain au chocolat because that's what it said on the menu, even though she knew we were in chocolatine land. And the waiter was like, chocolatine? Like, and he was
Paris,
like,
chocolat,
yeah,
pain au chocolat, Bordeaux, chocolatine.
kind of about it. And Meryl was like, well, I mean, it says pain au chocolat on the menu.
That's
So
good.
even here, culturally, like, right? It's like, but that image of, because when you talk to Bordelais people about pain au chocolat, they're like, it's a baguette with a bar of chocolate in it.
Yep.
That's what pain au chocolat was when I was a kid. So that I learned a petit pain, meaning the little croissant.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
But
But what you were saying about your grandmother, Marissa, that's super interesting. I don't know if I ever told you this, but so Colette, you don't know. We just met. I in 2015, I had a bicycle accident, and I was riding without a helmet because I was away from home, and crashed and had a traumatic brain injury, like to the point of where I was helicoptered to a different hospital because the one that I was first brought to didn't deal with that, and 3 weeks later, I'm walking around the rehab place after having been in a stupor for 5 days and not being awake at all, and then a regular station with that. I ran into one of the EMTs who was like, "Weren't you the girl that was brought in by Chopper from Newbury?" And I'm like, "That's what they tell me." And he says, "Yeah, we didn't think you were going to make it." Okay, cool. So anyway, I fell on the part of my brain that was injured was speech and language. And in the first couple of days when I wasn't present, really, they had to keep waking me up and ask me all these questions to see if they had to do surgery or not. And they would ask, like, who's the president? What year is it? And all I would do is I would answer them correctly, but in German and in French. I would not answer in English.
English was not part of
They're
it.
my first two languages. So my ex-husband who flew in, he said, no, 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 she's giving you the right answer. Because they were like, oh my God, this is wrong. We need to operate. I don't know what she's talking about. And he's like, no, that's correct. Because he spoke German. He understood somehow.
No, she speaks correctly.
Yeah. But that's interesting because the brain was obviously not working properly. But from there, I then had, because I didn't need surgery and I completely recovered very quickly, they suggested that two different neurologists, neurosurgeons, have since then suggested, one in the United States and one in Germany, that possibly because of me being multilingual, that's why that part of the brain was much more pliable and healed so much faster than it would have been for a monolingual person.
I wonder about that because that's real important when it comes to learning something later on in life. Like I learned Spanish. I started to learn Spanish when I was in my 30s. And so, I'd had I had, you need tortilla, whatever. But it was interesting because it was a little bit harder for me to get to Spanish speaking because I understood it, but then I would respond in French. And they'd be like, no, no, no. French class is down the hall. I'm like, oh, okay. This is Spanish class. Got it. And when I tried to learn Hebrew, it was the same thing. I understood it. It worked in my brain as a comprehension, but I couldn't produce it.
The receptive versus expressive.
Expressive, exactly. Yeah. And so it was very interesting that that whole idea of the tracks, that's where they came up. It's like, I know I have it. I know I can manipulate it. I can feel it, but sometimes I didn't always produce it. So it was very.
The track's a little rickety right now.
Yeah, exactly. The older I get.
Well, and it's interesting because that was the whole when we came here and Owen started Petite Section and in school and they were like, oh, he'll be fluent in 3 months. And because their experience had been kids adopted by French speaking families, but they had never had this experience before of a
bilingual.
a bilingual. Well, we weren't bilingual at home, right? We spoke English at home, and so he was sort of learning French by being out on the street. But then he would come home and we'd speak English, and out on the street, like he was, like going to the supermarket and like play dates,
like an alley cat
not
out on the
wandering
street.
the streets at 2.5. But like, and so they after 3 months, they were like, really like, well, we can't evaluate him, and like, because they had their check boxes of how they were going to evaluate how well he was doing. And I remember saying to the teacher, like, well, like, he's coming home and telling us everything, similar to what you're saying, right? Like, he's coming home and telling us what you taught him in school in English. So we know that he understands everything you're saying.
Right.
And maybe if you ask yes or no questions, or like if I'm somebody who speaks English is sitting there while you're asking him the question in French, because he's probably telling you the right answer in English, and you just don't know. And they're like, oh no, like, this is,
Can't do that.
yeah. But then he came out in full sentences when he started speaking, so he was not like testing the waters, right? He wasn't trying to, he just needed to process until he could get it all out the way he wanted to. Versus, we've had this conversation before on a different episode, Zachary, who was born here, who had a nunu at the beginning, from a daycare provider at 4 months old, who was, at her house all in French, at our house all in English. And he was constantly mixing up words. And I think part of it is personality. We talked about that too, but it was like, he just wanted to express himself. He just wanted to talk. So he was going to talk in whatever word came first, whatever language the word came first. And Owen was like, I want to sit here and process and figure it all out and then communicate when I'm ready. But it was very, very different. And at the end, it was like the receptive was clearly there for both the kids, like light years before they were able to express themselves fluently in both languages.
I think it's very common. Being a language teacher, that would be the last thing I would get from a student. I mean, they might understand me, they might be able to figure it out, they know the vocab, they can point it out, they know all the mechanics of it, but producing it was something that was very hard.
Yeah.
And so production, I used to say to them, don't get frustrated, production's the last portion, so just keep pushing, you'll get there. But yeah, you used to have to force it. You used to have to put them in a situation where they had to be forced to make that sentence work. And if it wasn't correct, I always told them that, don't worry about whether it's the correct conjugation. Just make sure you get that vocab through. It's okay. So we used to play games. I played games with my students all the time. Well, they were only starting language at age 14, so that's a little late. But I'd play games where they had to be outside the door of the classroom, and they'd have to knock. And when they opened it, a person who opened the door would ask them a question, and they had to respond to be able to come back in. And so they were like, I said, au revoir, we shut the door again. And so another person would, knock, another person comes over and asks them another question. So it was never the same question. They couldn't take the time to process that question, then they answer it because somebody else had come up with another one. So it was funny, and they still talk about it. I mean, I still see some of my students, and they're like, oh my God, that really got me thinking. I had to produce. I had to say something because I wanted to get back into class. I wanted to ask a question, not just answer them. So, so that.
Well, kids nowadays at 14, they'd be like, okay, cool, I have a hall pass.
Right.
That's what
there were plenty of those too. They were hanging out in the hall having a good time. Yeah. Actually, one time the principal came down the hall and he was like, the young man was outside and he's like, and he was a really good kid. So he was like, what's going on that you're outside the classroom? Like, what did you do? So knock, and he goes, I'll show you. And he knocks it on the door and somebody opens it up. And I'm standing on the inside, so you don't see me. So I'm trying to prompt the kid who's asking the question. But, and I could hear the principal's voice. So I look out and I'm like, oh, we're fine. We're just playing a game. It's fine. He's not in trouble. Everything okay in here? Everything's fine.
And now you may come back in. No matter what the answer.
We gave him a pass.
They did when at the French immersion school, we try to sandwich the stuff in the very beginning in kindergarten. We spoke like 75% English, 25% French, and then it reversed after a while because the kids would come at age 5 and not have had any exposure to French before.
Right, right.
But or we would sandwich it to where we would say a sentence in French, then say it in English, and then say it in French again. And the studies have shown that it takes around 18 months for somebody to become fluent in another language, because it takes around 18 months for a child to start speaking in complete
Right, and to
sentences.
hear it all that
Yeah.
time. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it makes a difference. And I was when I retired, I was tutoring a young lady who was in a bilingual school in New York. And her parents had moved up to Narrowsburg, New York, which is in the country, and they were a little worried that she was going to lose it. And she was about 7, and they asked me if I'd tutor. And I was like, "Ugh, I didn't want to do that." And so I said,
Just retire.
"Okay, I'll tell you what. If I'm going to do it, I'm going to charge you a lot of money, just so you know." And they're like, "Oh, well, whatever." So I put a huge price tag on it. They said, "Fine." And I said, "After I've met her, then we'll decide how this is going to work." So I'm thinking, oh, I don't want to go through colors and, language and, the apples and fruit. I didn't want to do all that again. So I met her, and she was so cute. I mean, the first day I drove to their house, I got there before they came back from walking from the bus. So I'm already parked, and I'm sitting in my car, and I'm thinking, okay, nobody's here, so I'll just wait a little while. And she comes running down the driveway, and she said, "Bonjour, madame, comment ça va? Oh là là, je suis ravie de vous faire connaissance." She didn't stop speaking French for the whole hour I was sitting there with her, and I thought, okay, this will be good for me, for you. So we went ahead with it, and to this day, I still keep in touch with her. Every once in a while, we text each other. But she was so adorable, and I thought, wow. So I asked the mother, "How did this happen?" And she said, "Well, it wasn't so bilingual as the school was a bilingual, but her French, the kindergarten was pretty much in French, and she was learning about things in French, like what you would learn in kindergarten, all her colors and all the numbers, but they learned about dinosaurs in French. They learned everything you would be interested in. The French was full on. There was never any explanation in English unless they needed to, or they used pictures, or they tried not to use language to explain something. They tried to use gestures and pictures, and I thought, wow, because she really had an amazing concept of the language. She at 7 was really able to hold a conversation, and it was a deep conversation. I mean, I could have asked her philosophy on education. I mean, she would have had an answer. It was just very interesting concept, and I thought, I hope she continues. But
Yeah,
they grow. She was really worried. The mother in the end was worried because they were going back now because the COVID was over, and they were going back to the city. And the mother had gotten another job, and the husband had gotten a different job. So they were moving back. They had this country house. They were moving back to their full-time house in the city. And she was supposed to go into Sankyam. And they were really worried because at this point, we kept it oral. I'd never tried to, because, she was just
right.
English, and I didn't want to confuse, the pedagogy too much. So I was just leaving it oral, and we did a lot of talking, and she would read things. She had magazines and things her mom had gotten that would come from France. So now the mother was worried, oh my God, she doesn't know how to conjugate verbs.
Yeah.
So trust me, she knows how to conjugate them. We'll just have to show her how they're written.
Yeah.
So all summer we were playing games, and I had like little flashcards, and I would put them out and say, you have to connect the verb with the subject. And she had to write an essay to get into this program. And the mother said the school was so impressed because they had interviewed her in April orally, and they were impressed with her then. But now they had asked her to do some writing, and she really couldn't do it. So they were concerned. They said, well, we'll give her the summer, and you let us know when she comes back. So she went back in August after the summer of us tutoring, and she wrote this beautiful essay about how she loved her French teacher. So I was like, wow, yes, good for you.
But Francisca was super fluent at the same age, 6, 7. And she was lucky that she always had a native speaker in kindergarten, first and second grade. When she gets to third grade, she gets an American, and she comes back the first day, and I said, so how is Madame, whatever her name was? And she says, oh, elle est très gentille, mais quel drôle d'accent, maman. She has a funny accent, but she's really nice.
Exactly. Especially if she's
And
hearing native speakers. Like, quel drôle l'accent. No, I was teaching English in Nepal, and so typical of kids. I had a fifth grader tell me that I wasn't saying it right. I was teaching them something that she had learned in another class, obviously with a Nepalese teacher, and I wasn't saying it right. And I said, "What do you mean?" And she says, "You don't say that right." And I said, "Well, as it's my language, native, I don't know what your other teachers say, but this is the way I say it in my country." And she's like, "Oh, okay, I'll accept that." But she wouldn't go on with me because I wasn't saying it right. It was just very funny. A different accent.
oh,
They don't
yeah, it
understand
took
how that
me.
works.
Go ahead. What did she say?
No, they don't always understand how that works. Like, what do you mean? Yeah, like, she's nice, but she has a funny accent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I learned British English first. I know how that goes.
Exactly.
My kids make fun of my mom's French accent because it's a very Belgian
Oh,
accent
very
and kind of
Belgian.
mixed in with Portuguese. But yeah, it's funny. They were like, Vava speaks weird. Her French is perfect. Like when they were little, like her French is really good, but like
A
her
funny accent.
she's a funny accent.
That's
That's all
funny.
I got about her English too.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this lady had an American accent. But yeah, my daughter would tell me these whole stories about how machines, they did simple machines in second grade. So she would come home and tell me all about it. Or she would, Marissa got her into wildcrats at the time when our kids were little. Marissa said, "Hey, you should check out wildcrats." So my kids were totally into it. And they learned about pangolins on one episode, and I had no idea what that was. But I was out by myself with them, and the rule was you speak only German or you speak only French. So she gave me that entire episode all in French, and she was in first or second grade, I forget, but all about pangolins, and I learned a lot. And my son, who's 3 years younger than her, so he would have been maybe 4, but he had now been around it so much. He was just, "Oui, maman, c'est ça." Oui.
That's it. It's true.
She's got it. That's cute. So now that you're in the States, what are you doing with your children?
Well, she's always been in the States with
I've
her.
always been in the States. My children were all born here.
Ah, that's
Yes, I mean, not I have not always been here. I came here for college and then
right,
just
right.
kind of stayed. But
But it's interesting because so Astrid and I met in a miscarriage support group uh, before we had our first children, who are 6 weeks apart. Then, but we made it through. We made it through the miscarriage, and then we made it through trying to conceive again, and then the pregnancies and all the
All the
the
chaos of that,
anxiety and
yeah.
neuroses that followed. Um, but but what I think is really fascinating is when some of the conversations we've had about when Franzi came back here, and because her oldest daughter spent a year in German school. I feel like it was a long time ago, but it was just last year, wasn't it?
it's just,
feels
it was
like
just 10th grade, yeah, last
decade
year.
ago. And we've had a couple of episodes where we've talked about that experience of like, you know, getting like her like having to learn how to learn German in German school, which was
Right,
different
yeah.
than having to learn German in America, speaking to your mom, or having to, like, exactly what you're saying, right? And also having to learn culturally in the German culture with the German language, and the growth of that. And it's definitely a conversation that that we have with our kids a lot, because they don't know any different than the French school system.
Right.
And they don't, when we tell them that, like, the way that I learned French in America was how they learn English here, they're like, "Oh, no wonder your French is bad."
Exactly.
They don't say
They're like, oh, now I get
I
it.
get it, yeah.
Because
Say
they
that. Oh,
don't do what you're talking about, right? It is like everything is explained in French. All the instructions are in French, and then the question is in English.
Right. And you're supposed to come up with an answer.
Yeah. And it's like, well, you just talked to me for 15 minutes in French, and like now I have to figure out what, like, I have to, figure out what you just said to me in English and then find the words to answer that question. So yeah, it slows down the process a lot, I think, because there's so much French being spoken in that
And
class.
we do, and as language teachers, guilty. You spend a lot of time explaining. I'm like, why are we explaining to them? Just use it and they'll get it, or they won't, whatever. Yeah. And it always depended on how strong their own native language was. Were they readers? Were they people who spoke about intellectual properties, or did they, they just talk about TV shows or whatever it might be? Like, so when they had some strong background in their own language, I didn't have to spend as much time explaining it, except, of course, the French love to have, the plus que parfait, the parfait. So, so
all the verb tenses.
All those verb tenses, and, they just were like, what? Yeah. So
if they even know what that is. If they even know what that is.
They don't in their own language.
I was so happy to switch at the German school to the adults, because most of the kids, and this may just be the Missouri school system, it may not be New York, but they don't, English is not being taught properly.
Language, no.
Yeah, like I'll talk to them about a verb or versus an adjective or an adverb, and they're like, what? I mean,
talking about, yeah. And that was the problem, is their English skills were lacking. So now I'm expecting them to understand this in another language. And I used to always try to speak in the language. And my colleagues would say to me, you're in America. I'm aware. Doesn't mean I can't speak Spanish with my students or French with my students.
Yeah. I want them to be fluent.
Yeah, that's the point of learning the language, is to use it. So I used to make a little luncheon room. We had this big room about the size of this room here that was by the elevators, so kids with wheelchairs could get up and down the floors in our high school. So I would just put a table in there and invite 6 kids to come have lunch with me. If you bring your lunch, bring it. If you get lunch, bring your tray. I would tell the lunch ladies, I have 6 kids today. I'm going to be up here. And we would have lunch together, but it would be in the language.
I love
so
it.
If it was French, it was French. If it was Spanish, it was Spanish. But so kids, and I always invited 5 or 6 kids from the different classes, so they get to know their friends who were also taking class and see how their friends are doing. So we just would have language lunch together, and they would be like really surprised. I'd bring a bag, so my lunch was always in a bag, and qu'est-ce que j'ai dans mon sac? And they'd have to come up with things and ask, yes or no questions. And so it was always like, so fun of a game. Like they could eat all they wanted and it didn't matter, but I wasn't going to eat until they had figured out what I had in my bag. So it was just to try to get them to talk. It was always
that's a cute idea. I love that idea.
We had to do everything we could to get them to talk, because they were like, huh? What's that?
So would you invite the kids that you had previously left out in the hallway, just like kind of to make up for it?
Often, especially if they got, especially if a kid was stuck in the hallway for a long time, like, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 questions have been asked, they still hadn't answered. I'd bring them to lunch and I would get they could sit and listen. I mean, you didn't have to talk. I might ask you some questions or ask you to say something, but it wasn't mandatory that you spoke. And so that same kid would be listening to the other kids talk. And they would be at various stages. Like, could be at Spanish level 1, or they could be at Spanish level 4, or French 1 or 4. So when they got through the lunch, because those kids usually bought lunch, so they're taking their tray back. I'd buy them an ice cream for having sat through a half hour of language without making a fuss and worrying. You deserve an ice cream today, or a cookie if they wanted a cookie from the cafeteria ladies.
I'm curious, how much do you think, is like talking about cultures and stuff, like how much do you think that your experience growing up with, we started this by talking about like being so blended, right? Just added to the creativity and the patience that you had with your students?
Oh, I would definitely say my experiences had a lot to do with why I taught the way I taught. Because I remember language classes like you're talking about, everything was explained in English and they would ask me a question in French and expect me to answer and spell it right, have accents and everything. But I was always trying to make it relevant. So because the way I learned faster and the way it made sense to me is because I had to speak it. So, my cousin would say, here's this, I need you to go to the store, here's the list. And I needed to understand what was on that list. So it was important because, I was picking it up for the family. So it was always relevant. And so to me, if you're going to learn a language, you had to make it relevant. You had to make it touch to the whatever you're doing, every day. So that's definitely part of it. And it was also because for the longest time, French was the secret language of my parents. They spoke to each other in French. So if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to listen carefully and sneak in there and get a word in
It's how
edgewise.
I learned English.
Yeah, yeah. So
My
it was
parents did that in English.
exactly, and so that was once again relevancy. It made a difference to what we were doing on Sunday if I understood what they were talking about, what they were planning. So yeah, so I think that had a lot to do with it, and I also understood when kids got stuck because having been stuck myself learning a language, it was like, oh yeah, I know, I see that look. I recognize that look. So yeah, so that probably had a lot to do with it, with my patience with them and knowing that, they weren't going to get it the first time around, first try. I would get upset with kids who didn't try. That was what cut you off. You're not even trying. You didn't even do your homework, Yeah, I can tell. So yeah, so there was yeah, it had a lot to do with and also understanding, like, my secret language of my grandparents was Arabic. And I would love to be able to understand that. And I understand, kif kif and j'ai la cafard, things like that. I knew, well, I could always mix some of the words they brought into it, but yeah, so that was probably because it was more relevant that they were speaking and wanted to understand it. But yeah, I would think my experiences of having been in situations where you don't know what everybody's talking about, like you can get the gist maybe, or you can get a word here and two, but they're speaking so fast you have no idea what's really going on, and all of a sudden they would say, "And qu'est-ce que tu penses?" Oh, je sais pas.
Every day of my life.
Yeah. Plus lentement, s'il te plaît. So I remember, I'll never forget this. I don't know if you know who Michel Bouchna is. He's a French actor who's our age now. I mean, my age, I should say. He's in the late 60s. And he was very popular in the 80s, 90s in France. He did a lot of movies, he did a lot of plays. But anyway, his father was my father's best friend from Tunisia, but he was also a doctor. And then lived on, what is that, by the Bateau Mouche, Iéna, the Quai Iéna. It's a very la-da-da neighborhood of Paris. So, I'm in Paris. They're like, oh, you should come to this party. And I said, oh, how nice of them. I loved Michel. I was like, sure, I'll come. Because he was only a few years older than I was at the time. He was very adorable. So I said, sure, I'll come. So I went. My father's like, oh, aren't you lucky you got invited to adopt it? It must have been some sort of dinner party. Well, there was we are talking about high class, very upper echelon French people, very proper accents. And, the wine and all the glasses and all the silverware. And I'm, a little country bumpkin sitting here going, I don't know what to do next. So you're just in this element that you're way out of your own, comfort zone. So I'm just watching and, oh, she's using that fork. Okay, so I'll use that fork to take this now. Oh, he's using that glass. Okay, that must be for the white wine, So like, you just really had to sort of go along, and I had no idea what people were saying because they were speaking so fast and with these very, very elevated sort of, like the King's English. I mean, it was a very elevated French that was way beyond me. And so I remember them saying to me at one point at the night, because I started to gather my stuff and I think I've had enough. I'm going to go home. My head hurts. They were like, it was so lovely for you to come, and it was so lovely to meet an American who speaks French. And I thought, I barely said 3 words all night, but I'm so glad you think I speak French. Thank you. But they were kind, but at the same time, they were talking about things I knew nothing about. I was 18. I didn't read the newspapers. I wasn't always, on top of, I was politically involved, but I wasn't always on top of what was the French political scene. And they were talking about all sorts of, taxes and all sorts of things, and I had no clue. And I just sort of listened and watched, and I thought, that must be what my students feel like all the time. They have no clue what I'm talking about. So it was interesting. I mean, Michelle barely gave me any attention also, so that was another disappointment of the evening. Time for me to go. So, but it was funny because that definitely stuck with me as far as an experience I remember feeling uncomfortable with and out of my element and not sure what to do next, and really felt like a country bumpkin. I just like, whoa, these people were so elegantly dressed and dripping in jewelry and diamonds and rubies, and I'm like, and I remember I had one of those peace rings and a mood ring. I was definitely not of the same echelon, but it was an interesting evening for sure.
I think it's so fascinating because, one of the reasons that Astrid and I, when we talk, and then we thought this would be such a wonderful podcast to do, is because these are the things that were like we were able to talk to each other because we knew each other, right? Like we knew, like, especially when I moved here and I knew, Astrid spoke French, Astrid had the experience moving to America, like there was somebody else I could talk to who got it. And so to hear your stories and to hear like how that influenced your life, I think it is part of that, the hope that we have, right, is like when we talk, as frustrating as it can be sometimes with our kids, and like especially around the different culture stuff, the generational stuff and the language stuff, like at the end of the day, to know that that there's going to be a time when they're looking back going, oh, that thing that happened, that experience is making me more empathic, is making me more curious, is making me feel more grounded.
Or just even more aware of who I am.
Yeah, more, exactly, like more self-aware. I think that's really what we all hope for as parents. It's what we all hope for as humans. And so, right, like we want to be self-aware, we want to be empathetic, we want to be compassionate, we want to be curious, we want to be observant, and so everything that you're saying, I think, really just speaks to how important it is to know what it feels like to feel uncomfortable, and whether it's because of a different language or a different culture, like it actually helps you expand and grow as a person instead of like it just being like mom said blah blah blah.
Mom told me. No, but even later on in life, and when I became a teacher, every year I tried to do it every semester, but I did it at least once a year. Would take a course where I had to be the student, where I had to remember, oh yeah, I got to do my homework. Oh yeah, I have this project due. I have deadlines. I have, so that I would get that sense of I'm not the only person in charge here. There's another person in charge. So I think that constantly doing that reminds you that yes, in your professional life, you might be up here at the top of your game, but when you have to go into a class where you don't know everything, you have to learn what's being taught so that you can move forward in the class. That it's like, it's humbling. It reminds you, because I took a photography class and how to develop film. And I thought, I really have to pay attention because I've never used a camera like this before. Digital was, it's like I had to figure out the film and how to put it in so I didn't expose it all, and all that sort of stuff. So it was very interesting, and it was like, wow, that's very humbling. Or learning how to paint, because you just which one do you do first? And how do you make the shadows? And how do you make where's the light coming from? And all these things you had to think about. So it was very humbling in the sense of, I'm a professional. I know what my professional life is like, but this is something I need to sort of better understand where my students and sitting in my class are like.
And I feel like that's the way to sort of break through the clash of the culture clash, right? To sit in that, like,
in the other person's
shoes.
Chair. Yeah.
It's not always easy.
And sit with your discomfort afterwards.
Say that again.
And sit with your discomfort afterwards. Like, to sit through it and then go, oh, that's it.
Yeah.
And that's okay to be uncomfortable and to be taken out of your comfort zone. It's okay. You survived. You didn't. The world didn't crash on top of you. The sky wasn't falling. It was all okay. Yeah, and to process that, what made you uncomfortable and why, and
Right.
accepting it. Yeah, it's definitely part of the experience.
But then again, I think being multicultural, multilingual, you actually have much more of a chance to sit through this and sit with your discomfort, figure out what made you uncomfortable, because you've been there so many times in so many different ways.
It wasn't the first and only time. Yeah.
This wasn't the first time somebody told you were wrong.
Exactly.
So I think that's much easier than to work through it, as opposed to if you've grown up in one place, never really been out of it, been put into that situation, and only speak one language, because then your mind thinks very monotrack.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's it's an indigenous person who said the world you were born into is only one of the models of living. So like it's like to open up your mind to other situations, to other models that it's. And I remember hearing a lot in class from my students saying, "Oh, that's weird. They do that." Well, I know you think it's weird, but I'm sure what you're just saying right now is probably weird to the Frenchman or the Spaniard. So
they think it's weird you do a Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, exactly. You do
So
that.
much so. I actually kind of, when I was at the French school, I kind of refused to do it. At one point, we didn't do it in the very beginning. We were a charter school, but then at one point, the government came in and made us do the Pledge of Allegiance, and I just refused. Well, one, I was only their full-time sub. I wasn't a full-time teacher, so I'm like, well, they can't really fire me. Two, I'm not even American.
Do you really want me to
forget to do this again?
That I don't have a passport for? I'm like, I'm not a citizen.
Right.
My green card does not say
anything about that.
I don't know. How does it go again? Can somebody else do this? I don't know. That to me is still weird. The little kids, because you can't tell me that the 5-year-old really understands it one way or the other.
No idea.
And it's. I mean, we're going off topic, but I think it's that kind of thing, right? When you're used to sitting in the discomfort of, I don't understand what you're talking about, or I understand every other word, but not all of it, or, or like, I don't know which paper to fill out, like, right? The administration, how it works. I'm illegally here. Owen was illegally here for a while as well, for about 3 months. Yeah, like then in those moments when you're like, oh, this person isn't doing what I'm doing, you also get to, like, to your point, Astrid, right? It's like, instead of saying like, oh, that's so weird, it's like, oh, that's so interesting. Right. And like, even just that little language shift of going from like, her accent's funny to like, oh, she's got a cool accent. Like, she's from
somewhere else.
Yeah, she's from somewhere else. She learned French somewhere else. Like, we've talked about my French teacher who was from Texas.
Oh yeah, I went from Scotland and one from Texas.
And my mom, when she was
y'all.
Yeah, exactly. And my mom, when she learned English, she had an English teacher in university who was from China, and she was like,
oh Lord,
like she had only been in the country for like a year and a half or 2 years, and then here she's in university, and she's like, I don't understand my English class.
I had I had a Chinese teacher in college in money and banking, which I already knew nothing about. I still, with somebody with two business degrees, the finance part was never my thing because I never had any money, so it doesn't really matter to me, right? Um,
Connect.
and it took me forever to understand that all the count meant over the counter. It just, I couldn't, I did really poorly in her class too.
Zachary has a teacher. We were just talking about him. His math teacher this year is from the Outremer. He's from one of the islands in the Caribbean, and so he's fluent in French, obviously, but he's got an accent, and he
Mhm.
speaks really fast. And the very first meeting that I was in with him, I went home and I was just like, Zach, you got to tell me what he said. And I just like I was like I think I got every word, but like again going to that like to the right, it was I didn't sit there going like I would have felt uncomfortable being like I can't understand you, I can't understand you, I can't understand you. That didn't feel comfortable, and I understood enough to have a conversation with him. But I wanted to make sure I understood, and so I waited until I was in a safe space with a safe person that I could ask and be like, can I make sure that like I walked away with the same information that you
Um,
have. And yeah, I think it's beautiful because like we talk about, it makes the world a bigger place.
Yes.
When you can be in that like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about you and tell me why
Right.
you're here and tell me tell me your story. Rather than just like, oh, you're from Texas and you speak French and now you have to teach me and I don't understand a word you're saying. Like, we don't say bonjour, y'all. Like, that's just not.
That's just not.
Bonjour, y'all.
But sure, why not? Like, there's patois, there's like,
There's all sorts of
right?
Yeah.
There's, yeah, why not? So,
That is hilarious. Bonjour, y'all.
yeah, why not learn another way of saying over the counter?
Yeah, right. But it's funny because
Just her accent. She was the sweetest woman. I just could.
her accent was hard to understand. Yeah,
Yeah.
but sort of speaking to that again, like the cultural thing, I was using what I knew culturally of France when I lived here in the 70s. And so now things are so different again. And there's a whole slew of French musicians and film. And so culturally, even generationally, it was different.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I was using Yves Montand, I was using Edith Piaf. These were Georges Brassens,
Charles Aznavour.
Maxime Forestier, these were the people, so then I started realizing I needed to do some research, because there were some really great French rappers, there were some great French, rock musicians. And so I remember I came up with a list and I said, see if you can find anything, because I wanted to learn about those, see if you can find anything about these people. But it's because it was generationally, it was a different culture in a sense. I mean, I had the classic, but they were like, well, we found this video. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I've never seen that one before. So like, Stromae and a whole bunch of others. It was like really funny. It was interesting to find out what they came up with too.
Yeah.
So it was like an exercise, and once again, culturally, it was different. Like my kids, they were singing along. My sister, we had this vernissage for my father's work, and my sister was playing Yves Montand, Edith Piaf, so my kids were singing along with it because they knew all the words. I play those songs all the time, so they knew that. And then she switched to some of the newer ones, and they, Axel Red or something, and they didn't really know them as well. Sorry, I didn't get that.
Yeah.
That. My sister still lives here. I'm not just in touch. So culturally, it was different.
Totally.
But same with the Spanish too, because when I lived in Spain for a little while to get over that hump of not being able to produce. And I was supposed to be going into teaching it, so I was like, my Spanish teacher always gave me a hard time about my accent, and I couldn't, I would hesitate. I would be translating the French and English into French, and I'd finally get to the Spanish, So I said, I'm going to spend a semester in Spain, and I had two kids, so I brought them over. They were in French. They were living with my dad. I went to Spain, and it was so funny. I got so engrossed in the Spanish I was so really into the Spanish by the end, because my two roommates were Spanish speakers, so they didn't speak English. So I really got into the Spanish. And so the last night I'm there, they were throwing me this, my roommates were Spanish from Bilbao. They actually lived in the area. So they were throwing me this party, my last night in Spain. And, you know, they were all excited that they were throwing me this party. And this one friend brought a French couple he had met in the boulangerie that morning. And I'm like, oh, cool. You can translate for them. And couldn't speak French. It was like, I'm in Spain. I speak Spanish now. I don't speak French anymore. It was just one of those things. I was so engrossed in the culture and everything was going on around me in Spanish that French didn't come easily to me. I thought, okay, got the Spanish down now. It was so funny. I felt so bad for this couple because, you know, thank goodness they did speak a little Spanish, but I was like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to translate this joke and I really can't do it right now. I understood it in Spanish. I can tell you in English if you want. I'm like, no.
English doesn't work.
English is not working for us. But that was like, whoa, I was so entrenched.
Yeah.
I got into its track. Got the Spanish in its track. And I remember I came back from that semester and I went up to my Spanish, you know, professor and I was like, whoa, 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 in Spanish. And he was like, what happened to you? Where are you coming from?
Oh, you did it the right way.
I did it. I knew what was going to work for me. So now my next thing is, you know, I'm learning Italian, so I'm gonna have to go to Italy for a semester. Sorry, hon, gonna have to be in Italy for a semester. It's time for me to go. I want to learn. I want to get. You know, when those people were talking today, I was like, I can understand them, but I really would not have been able to say anything to them. I got to get that one down.
Yeah.
Next one. the next chapter.
And the next language to bring
to
add to the mix.
I haven't spoken Italian in so long. I can't even do it anymore.
See, you lose it.
Yeah.
You do.
You definitely lose it.
Yeah. Well, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Colette, for
thank you for
dropping in.
Thank you. You jumped right in. That was awesome. That's what third culture kids do.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You just proved it. And no matter how long you've been doing it, or no matter how young or old you are, you just jump right in. We had our oldest kids on the show before too.
We did.
How'd that go? A little harder to get them to talk.
It was about language and expressions, and both of them at the same time went, can we swear on this? At least we raised them politely.
Yeah. They knew that maybe they shouldn't do that.
Of course,
they need to ask before.
Yeah. Next time we'll have to do the littler ones. Get the younger ones on the call. They won't ask that question. They'll just start swearing.
Yeah, they won't ask, exactly. Well, it was lovely meeting you.
Well, nice meeting you too, Colette. Thank you.
Hopefully do it again sometime.
Definitely. You'll throw in some Spanish too for our listeners. All right. Thank you everyone for listening and watching and tuning in. And we hope to see you again soon. As always, please like and share. And if you have any questions, you want to talk or you want us to talk about something else, you want to be on the show, send us an email at cultureclashparenting@gmail.com.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.